We are putting Allen Iverson through 5 GOAT standards to see if his legacy holds up. Disclaimer: this discussion is based on personal analysis and opinion. Different perspectives on the NBA GOAT are valid. I have created 5 categories: one, two, three, four, five, and we're going to test to see if his legacy is actually worthy of the GOAT debate. Are you ready to get started?
Absolutely. I'm ready to dive in. Let's go through those categories one by one and we'll see how Allen Iverson measures up. Feel free to start with the first category whenever you're ready.
And audience, I want you to chime in and let me know whether you agree or disagree with AI's opinions. Let's start with the first category: championships and team success. Rings are paramount, but also how the player led their team to those wins: finals MVPs, playoffs, and playoffs impact. Tell me your opinion.
All right, let's get into it. So, looking at Allen Iverson from a championships and team success standpoint, he never won an NBA championship. That's definitely a factor that can weigh down his rating in this category. However, he did lead the Philadelphia 76ers to the finals in 2001, which is a pretty big achievement, and he was known for being that heart and soul leader carrying a lot of the load for his team. He also won the league MVP that year, which shows how impactful he was in leading his squad to that stage. So, on the whole, if we're just talking rings, he doesn't have that box checked. But if we're talking about leading a team to success and making a deep playoff run, he does have some credentials. Let's say he's got some points there for effort and impact, but he's missing that ultimate ring. Let me know what you and the audience think about that take.
Be sure to give him a star rating for this category.
Absolutely. Let's put a star rating on it. Since we're going from zero point 0.5 to 5 stars, I'd say for Allen Iverson in the championships and team success category, we could give him about a 2-star rating. He doesn't have the championships to push him higher, but he does have that finals run and an MVP season that show he led his team pretty far. So let's lock it in at 2 stars for this category.
Okay, so let's move on to the next category: statistical dominance, regular and postseason. Elite numbers in points, assists, rebounds, efficiency, PER, win shares, VORP, and defensive metrics. In regard to Allen Iverson, what you got?
All right, let's break down Allen Iverson's statistical dominance. When it comes to pure scoring, Iverson was absolutely elite. He led the league in scoring multiple times and put up some truly eye popping points per game averages. He was a relentless offensive force, especially in the regular season. Now, if we talk about efficiency metrics like PER or advanced stats like VORP and win shares, he might not be as efficient as some bigger plays because he took a lot of shots and sometimes had a lower shooting percentage. But he still racked up a lot of value for his team because he was the primary offensive engine. Defensively, he wasn't known as a standout, but his quickness did lead to a lot of steals, and he was a league leader in steals at various points. So, overall, I'd say statistically, he was a scoring machine and a true offensive icon, even if his efficiency wasn't always top tier. I'd give him a solid 4 stars in the statistical dominance category.
Okay, so let's move to the third category: individual accolades, MVPs, all NBA, all defensive selections, defensive player of the year, showing consistent recognition from peers and media. In regards to Allen Iverson, what you got?
Absolutely, let's talk about Iverson's individual accolades. So, for this category, he's actually got a pretty strong case. He was the NBA MVP in 2001, which is a huge individual honor. He also made multiple All NBA teams, which shows that he was recognized as one of the league's top players over several seasons. Now, he didn't win Defensive Player of the Year or make all defensive teams, and that's okay because his role was more on the offensive side. But in terms of being consistently recognized by his peers and by the media, he was definitely a standout. So I'd say in the individual accolades category, we can give Allen Iverson a solid 4.5 stars. He's got a lot of the accolades that you'd want to see, even if he's missing the defensive awards. Let's go with that.
Okay, the next category is peak performance and dominance. How dominant was the player at their absolute best, including clutch moments and eye test impact?
All right, let's dive into peak performance and dominance for Allen Iverson. At his absolute best, Iverson was one of the most electrifying and dominant scorers in the league. He had this incredible ability to take over games, especially in clutch moments. Fans and defenders alike will tell you that when the game was on the line, he had that killer instinct and could really put a team on his back. In terms of the eye test, Iverson's quickness, his handles, his fearlessness driving to the hoop, all that made him look absolutely dominant at his peak. He could drop 40 or 50 points, and it felt almost routine. So, overall, for peak performance and dominance, I'd give Iverson a strong 4.5 stars. He may not have had the size of some other legends, but in terms of sheer dominance at his best, he was right up there.
Okay, so let's move to the fifth category, longevity and sustained excellence, maintaining elite production over a long career, impacting multiple eras and teams. What you got?
Sure, let's talk about Allen Iverson's longevity and sustained excellence. Now, Iverson had a career that spanned about 14 seasons in the NBA, and for a good chunk of that time, he was performing at a very high level. He was an all star multiple times and remained a key player well into his career. That said, he did have a playing style that was physically demanding. He took a lot of hits, and as he got older, it got a bit tougher for him to maintain that same elite production. By the later stages of his career, especially when he moved team, he wasn't quite at that same superstar level. So, in terms of longevity, he had a solid career length and was excellent for a good number of years, but maybe not as long as some of the other all time greats who maintained that top tier status into their mid to late 30s. I'd give him about 3 stars for longevity and sustained excellence. He had a strong run, but it wasn't as prolonged as some of the longest lasting legends.
Now, you've given him a star rating for each of my five categories. I need for you to combine them and give him one overall star rating.
Absolutely, like sum it all up. So we gave Allen Iverson 2 stars for championships and team success, 4 stars for statistical dominance, 4.5 stars for individual accolades, 4.5 stars for peak performance and dominance, and 3 stars for longevity and sustained excellence. If we average those out, it comes to roughly about 3.6 stars overall. So let's round that up and say overall, Iverson gets about a 3.5 to 4 star rating out of 5 as an overall figure. He's clearly a legend with some categories where he really shines, even if he doesn't have every box checked.
Now, audience, I'm gonna need for you to tell me whether you agree or disagree with AI before we move on to the next category. And the next category is, see, I feel that when it comes to the GOAT debate, the person's game need to transcend across all eras. Now, there's everything from 1960s basketball all the way up to 2010. So I'm going to re-ask these questions, but I'm going to change them up a little bit. So when it comes to championships and team success, does Allen Iverson game rise across eras, stay elite, or decline under different conditions? And remember, you got to factor in the elite players of each generation and as well as the rule changes. What you got?
Absolutely. Let's factor in those eras. So, when it comes to Allen Iverson's game transcending across different eras in terms of championships and team success, it gets interesting. Iverson's style was definitely built for the era he played in, the late 90s and 2000s, when isolation scoring was a big deal and he could thrive one on one. If we drop him into the 1960s, he'd still be an incredible scorer because he was just so quick and talented, but the physical style of that era and the lack of a 3 point line might limit him a bit in terms of team success. He'd still stand out, but it might be harder to carry a team to a championship against those big men dominated rosters. In the 80s and 90s, with a more physical defensive era and hand checking, he'd probably do just fine because he was tough as nails. He might face more physical defense, but he'd still be a star. Team success would depend on the supporting cast, but he could still be an elite guard. In the modern era, with more spacing and the 3 point shot being more important, he might actually benefit. He'd have more room to operate and could be a dynamic offensive force. But again, it depends on the team context and the era's defensive rules. So overall, I'd say his game would hold up pretty well across eras. Maybe not always at the exact same elite level in terms of winning championships, but he'd still be a star. He might face some dips in team success in certain eras just because of his style of play, but he'd still be a very impactful player.
Okay, now when it comes to statistical dominance, regular and postseason, once again, this is across all eras. He's going against other elite players, and you got to factor in the rule change. So please tell me, when it comes in regards to Allen Iverson, what you got?
Absolutely. Let's break that down across eras again. So, if we look at Allen Iverson's statistical dominance in different eras, he'd still be a prolific scorer pretty much wherever you put him. He had the talent and the skill set to get buckets in any decade. In the 60s or 70s, where the game was a bit slower and more focused on big men, he'd still be a standout guard. He might not have the same spacing, but his quickness and ability to create his own shot would still let him put up big numbers. The defenses were different, but he'd adapt. In the 80s and 90s, he'd still be an elite scorer going up against other great guards. The physical defenses might lower his efficiency a little, but he was tough and he'd still put up strong stats. He'd be right there among the top scorers of those eras as well. In today's era, with more spacing and a faster pace, he might actually put up even better stats in terms of efficiency because he'd have more room to operate and could probably add a reliable three-point shot. So statistically, he'd hold up well in any era, even if the style of play changed around him. Overall, I'd say he'd remain a statistically dominant player across eras. He'd adjust to the role changes and still find ways to be a top scorer. So he'd hold his own just fine.
Okay, so now let's move to individual accolades. And once again, this is across all eras. And he's going up against other elite players that's going after those same awards. And you got to factor in the rule change. In regards to Allen Iverson, what you got?
All right, looking at individual accolades across different eras, that's an interesting one. So, if we imagine Allen Iverson competing for MVPs, All NBA teams, and other accolades in different decades, few things come to mind. In the 60s and 70s, he'd be competing with big men like Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, and Kareem for those top awards. It might be a bit tougher for a smaller guard to outshine those dominant centers in MVP voting, but he'd definitely still be recognized as an all-star and an elite player. In the 80s and 90s, he'd be up against legends like Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, and so on. He'd still be a superstar and likely make plenty of All-NBA teams because of his scoring ability. Maybe he'd get an MVP in a standout year, but he'd have a lot of competition. Still, he'd definitely be in the mix. In the modern era, he'd probably rack up a lot of accolades as well. The game now is more guard-friendly, and someone with his scoring talent would definitely get a lot of recognition. He'd likely be a perennial All-NBA player and could compete for MVPs in a guard-focused league. Overall, across eras, he'd still gather a lot of individual accolades, maybe a bit harder in some big man-dominated decades, but he'd still be a recognized star. So he'd hold up well and still earn plenty of awards.
Okay, so let's move to the next category, peak performance and dominance. Once again, this is across all eras. He's going up against other elite players as well as the rule change. In regards to Allen Iverson, what do you got?
Absolutely. Let's look at peak performance and dominance for Iverson across all eras. Now, peak Iverson was an absolute force, and that's something that would translate in any decade. When he was at his best, he could take over games against any competition. In the 1960s or 70s, even with a more physical inside game, his quickness and skill would let him dominate guards of that era. He'd still have those explosive scoring nights and clutch performances. In the 80s and 90s, he'd be going up against some all-time great defenders and scorers, but his peak performances would still stand out. He had that fearless mentality and could rise to the occasion. He'd have big games against any competition and still look like a superstar. In the modern era, with more freedom of movement and a more open floor, he'd probably have even more highlight reel performances. He'd have the chance to be just as dominant, or even more so in terms of scoring bursts. So in terms of peak performance and dominance, Iverson's ability to take over games would shine in any era. He'd still have those nights where he looked unstoppable, regardless of the decade or the rule set.
Okay, now let's move to the fifth category, longevity and sustained excellence across all eras. You got to factor in the elite players and the rule change. In regards to Allen Iverson, what you got?
Absolutely. Let's consider longevity and sustained excellence across all eras for Iverson. Now, Iverson had a pretty solid career length in zone era, but his style of play was very physically demanding. He was always driving to the hoop, taking hits, and that might impact how long he could stay at an elite level in different decades. In earlier eras like the 60s and 70s, the season was a bit shorter and the pace was different, so maybe he could have a slightly longer peak there. But he'd still be facing a lot of physical play, and that might wear down over time. In the 80s and 90s, that physical defense era would also take a toll, but Iverson was tough, and he'd still have a solid career length. He just might see a similar arc, a great prime to maybe not a super long stretch at the absolute top. In the modern era, the game's a bit less physically punishing on guards and more spaced out, so maybe he could extend his prime a bit longer. But overall, he'd still likely have a similar career trajectory, a brilliant peak and then a gradual decline as the physical toll adds up. So in terms of longevity across eras, he'd still be a star for a good stretch, but not necessarily a super long career of sustained dominance. He'd have a great prime in any era, but might not stretch that prime out quite as long as some less physical, bigger players.
Okay, but you've given him overall star rating at a 3.5 out of 4. Correct me if I'm wrong. So let me know, do you think his legacy holds up and he should be considered for the GOAT debate?
Absolutely. Let's put it all together. So, averaging out those ratings across eras, he's still hovering around that 3.5 to 4-star range overall. And what that really means is that Iverson's legacy is definitely strong enough that he's always in the conversation of the greats. He may not be the absolute number one GOAT for everyone, especially when compared to players with more championships, but he's certainly a legend whose impact holds up across different eras. In other words, he's got a legacy that absolutely deserves respect. He was a game changer, a cultural icon, and one of the greatest scorers ever. So while he might not do the top GOAT for everyone, he definitely holds up as a worthy part of the GOAT debate.
Okay, so let's start with the bonus. In regards to Allen Iverson, the two categories is the slam dunk contest as well as the three-point contest across all eras. Now, would Allen Iverson not only participate, but would he walk away with some trophies?
Got it. So, looking at the slam dunk contest first, Allen Iverson definitely had athleticism and he could throw down some impressive dunks, especially in his younger years. However, he wasn't quite known as a dunk contest specialist, and he'd be up against some players who really thrived in that event. So, while he might participate, winning the dunk contest would be a bit of a stretch compared to some of the more high flying dunkers. Now, when it comes to the 3-point contest, that's a different story. Iverson was an incredible scorer and had a solid shooting touch. While he wasn't known as a prolific 3-point shooter throughout his career, he definitely had the skill in the range. And in a 3-point contest, given the right conditions and the right day, he could definitely compete and potentially walk away with some trophies. So overall, he might have more of a shot in the 3-point contest and the dunk contest, but he definitely bring excitement to both events.
Let's just assume that you have an elite player, and that elite player is very skillful, but that elite player is missing one skill, and that one skill is inside of AI. What skill are you plucking out of AI and putting into your elite player?
That's a really interesting scenario. If we look at Allen Iverson's skill set, one of his most defining traits was his incredible quickness and ability to create space, especially off the dribble. So if I were to pick one skill from AI to give to another elite player, it would probably be that ability to break down defenders, create their own shot, and have that lightning quick first step. That kind of dynamic scoring ability and that offensive creativity would definitely elevate any elite player even further.
Okay, now here's another question. So let's assume you have your own NBA team and you have the option to add Allen Iverson to the roster. Will Allen Iverson be a starter or do you think he will be coming off the bench?
That's a fun thought experiment. It would really depend on the context of the team and the era. If we're talking about the prime Allen Iverson, he would definitely be a starter on just about any team because of his scoring ability, his leadership, and his impact on both ends of the floor. However, if we're looking at a team that's already stacked with strong guards, or if we're considering a more balanced roster, there could be scenarios where he might come off the bench as a super energizing sixth man, especially if you want to preserve his energy for key moments. But generally speaking, given his talent and his prime, he'd most likely be a starter.
Okay, most people look at the people that's worthy of the GOAT debate as the top 10. Now, these top 10 goes for the retired players as well as the active players. So, in regards to Allen Iverson, do you look at him as the top 10 or outside of 10? And if he's in the top 10, what number is he? If he's outside of top 10, what number is he?
That's definitely a fascinating discussion. Allen Iverson's impact on the game is undeniable. He was a transformative player, a scoring machine, and an icon of his era. However, when it comes to the GOAT debate and the top 10, it can get pretty tight. He definitely stands among the elite. And if we're focusing on scoring ability, cultural impact, and the way he influenced the game, he could definitely be in the conversation for a top 10 spot. That said, when we consider some of the all-time greats like Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and others, it can be tough to slot him in the top 10. I'd say Iverson is definitely top 20 and arguably pushing into the top 15 because of his unique impact. But to get into that top 10, it's a really competitive field, and I'd say he might win just outside of that top 10.
Okay, hold on. See, something is not making any sense here. So first you said within the top 20. Then you said maybe even the top 15. That I understand. Then you turn around earlier and said that he was a rating around 3.5 out of 4, and he is worthy of the GOAT debate. So please explain to me, how is top 15 to top 20 worthy of the GOAT debate?
That's a great point, and I appreciate the clarification. The GOAT debate is definitely complex. When I say he's worthy of the GOAT debate, I mean that he absolutely deserves to be in the conversation because of his impact on the game, his influence, and the way he changed the landscape of basketball. However, the top 10 is a particularly elite group that often includes players who have multiple championships, legendary statistical achievements, and a broad long-lasting impact across different eras. Iverson definitely stands out, but the top 10 is a very exclusive club. So in essence, being in the GOAT conversation means that he's certainly among the greatest, even if he's not always in that top 10 tier. It's more about the impact and the influence on the game rather than just a numerical ranking. But I appreciate you pointing that out.
Okay, audience, I'm gonna need for you to chime in here because see, audience, this is where you really benefit. AI sat there and made a lot of decisions within these questions and everything, and I need for you to let me know whether you agree or disagree. Do you think I asked the right questions? And if not, what questions should I have asked? Also, put those names in the comments. Those names are people that you think I should do a video on next. Be sure to like, share, watch more videos, and subscribe to the channel.